And we are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today we are going to talk about another Dice Throne hero. We're going to break this down, how to attack, how to defeat, how to play as, how to play against the Pyromancer. Now, people who have been around the channel for a while may remember a year or so ago when I played a Pyromancer mirror match. Uh, Inadvisably under the influence of the one chip challenge. That was not an experience I care to repeat. So to start off here, I want to take a look at the pamphlet. So here's the complete pamphlet. As you can see, she's got a 3-1-1-1 dice facing, which is not the most forgiving, but it's not the most punishing dice face that we have in the game either. To get a little closer to some of the pamphlet stuff here, let's go through all of her status effects. So we're going to start with knockdown. Now, I personally kind of hate this status effect. Opponents, during their offensive roll phase, you will skip the entire offensive roll phase unless you pay 2 coins in order to remove the knockdown effect. So you kind of have to do it, or you're getting time walked. Your opponent's going to get 2 turns in a row. Now, it's not strictly 2 full turns in a row because you'll still get your income phase, so you got to do a little bit of stuff. But if you're not rolling your offensive roll phase, that's really bad. Now, most heroes are not going to be in the position where they're unable to pay this, but every once in a while, you back somebody into a corner and oops, knockdown, and you essentially get a time walk, which is very strong. Moving on to Burn. This is another very strong status effect for the Pyromancer. This kind of works like Poison. It's a persistent status effect. It's going to stick around forever, essentially, and it deals 2 damage during the upkeep every turn. That damage adds up really fast. 2 damage a turn is a lot, and unless they draw into exactly the status effect removal cards that they're looking for, which every hero has them in their kit, but not that many, or there's somebody like Monk who has the cleanse token, Burn can stick around. I've seen games where Burn does 10, 12, 14 damage. Like, it absolutely can happen. Fire Mastery. So this is the first part of the sub-economy for the Pyromancer. And I suppose before we go any further, I want to talk just briefly about strategy. Now, we're going to come back to this again and again throughout this, but Fire Mastery and managing this token is sort of the key element, or one of the key elements to navigating Pyromancer. The Fire Mastery fuels all of her strongest attacks. It's a core part of the character, and you're always losing it. You're always cooling off at the start of round. So you get 1 whenever an effect gives you 1, and during the upkeep you have to discard 1. And getting stacks of them can add a lot of damage to your effects over the course of the game. Finally, Stun. This is an absolutely brutal status effect. So Stun, a player afflicted with this token may take no actions of any kind. You can't do anything. They just eat some damage, and then the person who inflicted it gets to attack again. It's a little silly that Stun even requires a token because it lives on your board for such a brief moment of time. Like, the moment I inflict it, you then take the damage, and then the stun goes away and I attack you again. It is a very strong status effect. Definitely similar to Knockdown in the fact that it can steal a turn from a player or functionally give you 2 offensive roll phases kind of in a row. Very strong. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the board for the Pyromancer. Now, I say this every time I do one of these videos. The card art for the dashboard looks really good. That is not unique to this particular board, and I don't have a lot more to say about it other than, hey, this looks hot. All right, so let's move into taking a look at the board and these abilities a little bit closer. So we're going to start off here with Fireball. This is the basic attack. It requires you to roll a bunch of her most common die face, of which she has 3. So it's almost impossible to not get the deal 4 damage if you're going for this. But let's be real, you don't really want to go for this. This is going to be a thing that you fall back onto some of the time. Generating Fire Mastery, you get no immediate effect from it here, but you kind of always want to have Fire Mastery. This ability does have some upgrades. Looking at Fireball 2, we go to a 4, 6, 8 damage spread. So this is decent. 4 is a little below average, 8 is a little above average. So the damage spread is fine. You gain 2 Fire Mastery. Early game, I think this is an upgrade you probably play. It just sort of fits with the fact that you're gonna be rolling basic attacks. Like, you don't really want to roll basic attacks, but it's a thing that happens. Like, you miss your Pyroblast, which we'll get to later, and this is something that's gonna happen. If we're talking turns like 4 or 5, probably there's going to be greater demands on your ability to pay for things. Your combat points are probably going to be feeling some pressure, and selling this in that mid to late game probably makes more sense. If it's early game, I think this is a perfectly acceptable upgrade. Okay, so now we will move down to Pyroblast. Now, this, in my opinion, is one of the bread and butter abilities for the Pyromancer. You need 3 of the most common die face, the flame, and 1 of the sixes, and you deal 6 damage and roll 1 die, and you can either add 3 damage, add a burn, gain 2 fire mastery, or inflict a knockdown. Almost all of those things are good almost all of the time. This ability does also have a couple of upgrades. Starting with Pyroblast 2, you're still dealing 6 damage, but now you're throwing 2 dice, so you're going to get 2 of these following effects, which could be potentially 6 damage with the flames, uh, a burn plus 3 damage, and like any 2 of these is pretty good. It's not as good if you roll the 4 or the 6 because those are both on, of course, but the ceiling is much higher with this upgrade. Taking a look at the third, still 6 damage, you throw 2 dice, and you get to re-roll one of them, and you have the potential to add 3 damage per flame, a burn, 2 fire mastery per 5, or a knockdown on a 6. Both of these upgrades are good. You probably don't need both. If you get even one of them, that's probably fine. If you are playing the sort of game where you have a surplus of combat points and you're not feeling that pressure, which let's just take a minute to talk about one of the Pyromancer's biggest weaknesses, and that is her economy. You're not going to be drawing a lot of extra cards. You're not going to be generating a lot of extra combat points. So what you do have, you're going to have to be very judicious in how you spend it. So while it may not seem like a huge deal, the difference between 2 combat points for level 2 or 3 combat points for level 3, over the course of the game with Pyromancer, every single combat point, it really matters where you put it. So probably in most games, if you have the level 2 down and you draw the level 3, it's almost always going to be an easy sell unless you happen to be getting very fortunate with your rolls. To the Burning Soul. So this is a 5/5 ability. You gain 2 fire mastery and you deal 1 damage per fire mastery in the form of collateral damage to all opponents. So one of the rare multiplayer abilities. Uh, I'm not the biggest fan of this. Yes, if you're on the track with Pyromancer, where what you want to do is generate a whole bunch of fire mastery, and we're going to talk about the payoff for that here in just a second. This is a good way to generate fire mastery, but as it is, if you only roll the 2 5s that you need to activate this ability, like if this is your fallback and you end up on, okay, well, I'm going to gain 4 fire mastery, that's okay, and I'm going to deal 2 damage. That's rough. So I don't think this is ability you're going to chase, but you're going to kind of fall into it sometimes. Now, I will say, when you upgrade this to the Burning Soul 2, you get the ability to potentially inflict a burn. You get the ability to increase your fire mastery stack, which is a really big deal. You gain 2 fire mastery per 5 still, and you can deal 1 damage per 5 that you roll. So this gives you so many more benefits that I think if you see the Burning Soul upgrade, you get that as soon as you can, you slam that down, and that makes your Burning Soul much, much better. Without it, I am not as I'm not as into this ability without the upgrade. Yes, sometimes you're going to take it because it's the ability that you were able to fall back into. It's definitely better than a whiff, but where this really shines is when you get that upgrade out and you can start slapping on burns and increasing your stack limit on stuff. So moving down to Combustion. Now, this is the big Pyromancer payoff. Now, I will say these 2 abilities right here, Pyroblast and Combustion, I think are the 2 most important abilities on the Pyromancer board. They're the abilities that you're really going to want to do in basically every game. But Combustion, you're probably only going to want to chase this like once, because once is probably good enough. Combustion requires 1 of every die face, so it's not the easiest thing in the world. You need a 1, 2, or 3, and then you need a 4, 5, 6. So you're kind of on your way to a straight there, and Like, it is 4 unique dice. People will be able to mess with this, but it's not the hardest thing to roll. You gain a Fire Mastery, and then when you activate it, you remove 4 Fire Mastery tokens and deal 3 damage per token removed. Or if you have the upgrade out, you deal 4 damage per token removed. Um, I think the upgrade is worth it earlier in the game. It's not necessarily something you need to get out like turn 1 or 2 because it's going to take you time to build up the Fire Mastery to really make Combustion work. But if you're at the point of the game where your opponent is already down into like 10-ish, 12-ish range, you probably don't need the extra 1 damage per Fire Mastery that the Combustion upgrade is going to give you. You're probably within lethal range at 3 damage per Fire Mastery, but that's the dividing line, I think, really, is that you want to look at where your opponent is, how far away from lethal you are. The closer to lethal you are, the less important this upgrade becomes. But this ability is probably one of the best, if not the best, finishers in the entire game. If you're playing Pyromancer, you're absolutely going to be doing Combustion. Okay. Hot Streak. So, like everybody has a small straight, Pyromancer is no different. This generates 2 Fire Mastery and deals 5 damage plus 1 per Fire Mastery. Uh, that's fine. At the worst, it's going to be 7 damage, so that's like smack average damage. That's totally acceptable. If you have some existing Fire Mastery before this ability goes off, it goes up from there. So the upside is potentially pretty good for a small straight. I mean, if you're sitting on 5 Fire Mastery, that's 10 damage off a small straight. That's quite good. The upgrade to this increases the damage by 1, so you start with a base of 6 and 1 damage per Fire Mastery, and then it adds Scorch, gain 2 Fire Mastery, inflict a burn, and deal 6 damage. If you assume the burn goes through, that means Scorch attacks for 8 damage, which isn't a bad fallback roll. I don't think Scorch is something you're going to target, but a lot of times these secondary abilities that come on our ability upgrades are not abilities that we really want to target. They're just fallback rolls. And when you think about the Pyromancer's die faces being 3, 1, 1, 1, having some fallback rolls feels pretty good. All of that said, unless I'm really, really in on trying to chase straights the whole time, this is an upgrade I feel pretty comfortable selling. This is not one of my favorite abilities on the board, although again, small straights are really important to generate up the Fire Mastery you need for that end of game Combustion play. Taking a look at Ignite, I have a lot of the same things to say about this ability as I would say about the small straight. Straights are harder to roll than some other things, and they're more easily disruptible. If you're going to settle on a straight, you probably want to stop rolling on roll 2 and present with a reroll remaining in case your opponent has something to pick off one of those middle dice on your straight. This gives you 2 Fire Mastery and you deal 4 damage plus 2 damage per Fire Mastery. So if we're looking at a stack of, say, 4, that's 12 damage off a large straight, which is decent damage, and it can potentially go up from there. If we then take a look at the upgrade, this does cost 2 coins, and large straights are not the easiest thing to roll for, but it does add inflicting a burn, which is kind of a big deal. Burn is a serious status effect. It isn't something people can roll their defense for, and Pyro has to push as much damage as hard as possible. The fallback Blazing Soul increase your Fire Mastery stack limit. I do really like that. 5 Fire Mastery and a knockdown, in my opinion. That doesn't really do enough. I don't particularly like this power. I get how this would be better than nothing at all. This is actually pretty decent for setting up a next turn Combustion, but I don't think you're excited about Blazing Soul, and I don't know if there is enough in the Pyromancer's kit to justify paying for a large straight upgrade that you're probably not going to be able to chase because, again, the Pyromancer doesn't have card draw, doesn't have CP generation. So I think this is an upgrade you can feel pretty comfortable selling, and you'll probably need to because the Pyromancer is always a little throttled for resources. All right, moving down to Meteorites. So this is your mini alt, gain 2 Fire Mastery, inflict a stun, which is wonderful. It's such an annoying status effect. Then deal 1 undefendable damage per Fire Mastery and deal 2 damage collateral to all opponents. So the most relevant thing on that is stun. In its worst case scenario, you're going to gain 2 fire mastery and then deal 4 undefendable damage. Well, 2 undefendable, 2 collateral, and then you get another ORP. The best thing for Meteorite is that you are going to end up here when somebody tries to push you off your ult. Pyro has this really annoying thing where even if you helping hand them off of an ult, she still hits you for an annoying amount of damage if there's any pre-existing fire mastery, and then she gets to go again. It's kind of ridiculous. If we then take a look at the upgrade for Meteorite, really the only thing that changes is the collateral damage goes up by 1. Everything else remains the same. This costs 2 coins to get here. It does give you the 3/6 roll of inflict a knockdown, a burn, and a stun, which is actually pretty good. I feel like this is a mini ult upgrade that I actually want to take because so often the things I'm chasing with Pyromancer are Combustion and Ignite, both of which use a 6, so I tend to want to keep 6s a little more often. So having the 3/6 fallback of Meteoroid I think makes a lot of sense with this character, whereas generally mini ult upgrades are not something I go after. But I think on this character, unless it's deep in the late game, I think having that in play gives you the freedom to chase after 6s a little more than you would. And again, you're going to be holding 6s for those pyroblasts and those combustions. Okay, moving down to the molten armor defense, if we can call it that, the defense that does not defend. Um, Pyromancer's a glass cannon. She does damage, she eats damage, doesn't try to stop it, and her whole thing is a race. This is a damage race character. She's trying to get there first, and she wants to get there by doing more damage than you. If you're doing 7 damage a turn, which is about average, 7 damage, Pyromancer's doing 10. So she's gonna kill you faster. Her defense feeds right into that. In its default state, she has the ability to gain some fire mastery off of this and deal 1 damage on her most common die face. This is not a great defense. One of the things I always like to see when I'm playing Pyromancer is her defense upgrade. This is one of the abilities that I think is more highly valued with this character because of how she works. You really want to punish your opponent for attacking you. It costs 1 combat point to get Molten Armor 2. She still has the ability to gain Fire Mastery, gains the ability to inflict burn, and can still deal some damage. I think this is absolutely worth it. It can also go up to Molten Armor 3, which is going to cost you 3 combat points. Again, I think this is very much worth it. It still retains the ability to gain Fire Mastery, only now it hits on 5s and 6s instead of just 5s. She can burn, and she can deal damage on her 1 through 3 and 6 die face. This is stuff you want to do. You want to be able to afford this card because so much of the rest of her kit revolves around just getting that damage out there. She's not going to stop any damage. So you've absolutely just got to hit harder than the other person the whole time. That's just the way it is with the Pyromancer. So the last thing we want to take a look at here is her ultimate, Scorch the Earth. Like all ultimates, it takes 5/6s in order to activate this ability. She gains 3 Fire Mastery, a knockdown, a burn, deals 12 damage, functionally 14 because of the collateral damage rider, functionally 16 if the burn actually goes off. That's all very good. It's surprising she doesn't get stun here, but given that you're so heavily punished by stun in other parts of her board, I kind of understand it. Flavor text on this character is I just want to watch the world burn, and she absolutely does watch the world burn. Pyromancer is able to deal an unbelievable amount of damage. And again, I want before we move off from the board, I want to underline how important Pyroblast and Combustion are to this character. I think you can get away with rolling Pyroblast every single turn and just making that your whole strategy is just dealing 6, 9, 12 damage, inflicting burns, building up Fire Mastery, and then once at the end of the game, hitting that Combustion and getting a big attack for like 12 damage or more, 16 damage if you're able to find the Combustion upgrade. Everything else kind of feeds into those 2 abilities, but I think these are the 2 most important powers on her entire board. So let's move back to the card kit and let's take a look at some of her non-ability upgrade cards. So we're going to start with Warm Up. This costs 0. You gain 1 Fire Mastery. and then you can spend combat points as desired to gain additional fire mastery. The only time I ever use this is if it's near the end of the game and I'm going for the kill. If I know I'm trying to set up my combustion turn this turn and I've maybe got the cards in my hand, that's when I'll play this. Otherwise, I I almost always sell this. I typically rely on my board to generate Fire Mastery more than a card like Warm Up, but there are going to be some games where you're going to have the combat points and you're not going to have the Fire Mastery. So this exchange, it is a thing that can happen sometimes, but this is not a card that I'm real excited about. Usually I see this as an easy sell. Fire Up. This costs 3, which is a pretty expensive card for the Pyromancer. Increase the Fire Mastery stack limit by 1 and gains 2 Fire Mastery. Feels absolutely worth it. If you're able to get your Fire Mastery stack increased, that increases the potential of your combustion hits, as well as kind of protecting those tokens as you cool off. If you have more of them, there's more turns that you can spend seeking that combustion before you run out of gas. So this is a card I generally want to play. Late in the game, it doesn't matter as much, but I feel like increasing that stack limit feels pretty good. Red Hot, your mileage is going to vary. If you've got the Fire Mastery on your character, as long as you're getting, I think, 2 damage out of this, it's worth it. And if you can get 4, 5, 6, depending upon how you've increased your Fire Mastery over the course of the game, you pay 1 coin, get 5 extra damage, 4 extra damage. That feels really, really good. I think this is a good card, and it doesn't require a lot of setup. Yes, you do have to set up the Fire Mastery, but that is sort of what the Pyromancer is doing anyway. So this feeds into stuff you'd be doing regardless and gives you a really good benefit. Huzzah! Cost 1. Attack modifier, you roll a die. You can add 3 attack, a burn, Fire Mastery, knockdown. This sounds familiar because this is like basically Pyroblast, but on a card. I've already stated how I think Pyroblast is one of the keystone core abilities that makes the Pyromancer able to win games. Putting that onto a card and being able to attach the Pyroblast effect to a basic attack that you fell back into or a straight or something else is very, very good. I think this card is super playable, and at 1 cost, it fits well within her kind of throttled economy. The promo card for Pyro, I mean, what can we say about promo cards? They're all kind of the same. This one's called Infernal Infusion. You roll a die, and then you draw a card. Unless you get a 6, in which case you get max Fire Mastery. Now, as far as promo cards go, that feels pretty weak. Like, most promo cards, you get like all the status effects that that hero has. Maybe they decided that being able to inflict a burn for a 0-cost main phase card was a little too good, and fair, that probably is a little too good. Same thing with stun, but just a stack of Fire Mastery for, I think I'd rather have the card depending upon the situation. So the promo is whatever. Okay, overall, the Pyromancer absolutely excels at damage output, but like a lot of characters that play very aggressively, this hero is balanced by having little to no damage mitigation, and she's further hampered by having essentially no economic boost whatsoever. There's no card draw, there's no combat point generation on this board. So anytime you sit down across the table from a Pyromancer, make no mistake, you are in a race. If you are trying to out defend the Pyro, eventually she's going to get an undefendable 16 through with Combustion. If you are trying to damage for damage Pyro, what she's going to try to do is make you bleed more than you're able to make her bleed. So you are in a race. Undefendable damage helps a little bit because it allows you to avoid some of those more negative consequences of the Molten Armor on the Pyromancer's board, but she's not like the Shadow Thief, who's like so entirely dependent on his defense that characters that can produce a lot of undefendable attacks like Ninja are really a hard matchup for the Shadow Thief. Pyromancer doesn't suffer from that because all her defense does is augment her attack. So even if you take that weapon away from her, and that can be a really good weapon, her defense can generate 7, 10 points of damage over the course of the game easily. So it is an important effect, but it's not crippling when she doesn't have it because the rest of her board is still putting out so much damage. So in my opinion, the way you beat Pyromancer is you really want to force her to whiff. If you have like evasives and shadows and things like that, that's great. That is almost as good as forcing her to whiff because eventually the big attack is going to be undefendable. Eventually the big attack is going to come after she what status affects you. So you can't rely on hiding behind your shadows, your agilities. These aren't going to work forever. They're not going to keep you safe from the unending onslaught. You have to put the Pyromancer down. So most of the time, my opinion is the way you beat Pyromancer is you try to outrace her. You try to do as much damage as you can, as fast as you can, and you save your cards, your dice fix cards, to push her into a whiff. Because if you can push her into a whiff like one turn, or two turns, or into like weaker basic attacks, sometimes that's all it takes. Especially if you can like push her into something that's generating fire mastery when she's already at a max stack, and it kind of wastes that turn. That is as good as a whiff when you're fighting Pyro because she's so one track and it's such a race that if you can get her to stumble, usually even one turn, it's enough to throw the player off and they can't quite get there. I think if you've played any card games, the place where aggro always falters is when the gas tank runs empty. That's true in Dice Throne with like the Barbarian, and that's going to be true with the Pyromancer. Early game, she seems unstoppable, but once that combat point dial starts to creep down to 1 and 0, and that grip starts to be full of air instead of cards, now all of a sudden the Pyro is kind of at the mercy of her dice, which are not the most forgiving die face. And if you can push her off those abilities. So she's more susceptible to disruption than some other heroes, and she's more dependent on consistency to get wins than some other heroes, and she's less able to respond to disruption due to how throttled her economy is. So while the weaknesses of the Pyromancer are all there, they're really glaring and obvious. This is not a difficult character to strategize how you're going to beat. Actually doing it, it can be a little bit more difficult simply because she puts out such big damage numbers so consistently. Pyromancer has been one of the top played heroes in a bunch of different competitive events, and it really shows. The ability to do more damage than anybody else wins games. So if you're looking for that type of hero, the I'm all in on just trying to turn right and run you over and stack up the damage, and don't care about the charge of the light brigade kind of all in, no defense, all offense, no breaks kind of hero. Then the Pyromancer is the hero for you. However, may I recommend when you play with the Pyromancer, don't accompany it with the one chip challenge. Go win some games.